Good afternoon. It's good to see all of you. I am excited for this interview today. We oftentimes here around here get to study with the authors. This time we get to interview an author and get to hear a little bit more about Dr. Garrett in this process. I have some questions today for Dr. Garrett that we'll kind of walk through here. In light of this, the new book that he has out, there's a table back there for the book, Understanding Jeremiah. It's setting, composition, and message. You'll see the table back here. We're going to have the questions that I ask for him, and then you guys are welcome to ask questions as well. We do have 3 giveaway copies of the book for the first 3 who ask questions. So if you'd like to jot some things down as we're going through, little incentive there. So feel free to do that. Let's see. You guys know Dr. Garrett. I'll introduce him just quickly. I've had the privilege of being able to serve here with him for 8 years. But even before that, Dr. Garrett was one of my professors in doctoral seminars. And I'm going to tell a quick story. One of the things that I love about Dr. Garrett is his ability and the way that he gives direct and unambiguous feedback. In one of my seminar papers I wrote in an Exodus course, I presented the paper. It was his turn now to dismantle it. And he said, "This paper is just out of control." So I'm very thankful for that direct feedback and also just his heart to see students learn to love God's Word more and to interpret it and understand it rightly. And I think that's what he's done with this book as well. So Dr. Garrett, welcome. We're glad to have this time with you today. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I want to start with this one. Where did your interest in Jeremiah originate? And then maybe kind of as a secondary to that, how did your interest in Jeremiah shift as you studied for and wrote this book?
Many years ago, I was asked to write the commentary on Jeremiah for the Garrett series, which is out now. Now, that's a series which is primarily for preachers. I wrote the exegetical section, and a homiletician wrote the section to help preachers know how to preach the text. So of necessity, it was more of a, I don't know how to put it. It was a commentary that you did not want to go too deep into the weeds, because this was a commentary meant to help preachers preach the text, not a deep reading, exegetical examination of all the issues of Jeremiah. But naturally, if you're going to do an exegesis of Jeremiah, you're going to have to look into a lot of background issues. Where did the book come from? What was the life of Jeremiah? What was his time? What were his times like? And we'll get into this later, but why is Jeremiah seemingly such a chaotic book? It seems totally disorganized. And why is it so different in the Septuagint? You know, even though I wasn't able to put those things in the commentary, those were things I had to examine. And so as I examined them, I became more and more fascinated with them and became convinced that there was an answer to these questions. And so as the commentary got finished, I was grateful that Kriegel allowed me to do a second book that would get into all these other issues that were not really appropriate for a homiletical commentary. So that's what got me into it.
Yeah, great. Did your interest in Jeremiah shift as you studied for the book versus just the commentary?
Yeah, in the sense that, there were things I hadn't really thought deeply about or didn't even feel that there was going to be a clear solution to, such as the problem of the difference between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, that as I got into it, I thought more and more there is a solution to this, and I worked more and more on trying to find the solution. And so some of those kinds of problems really captured me as I began to wrestle with them.
Yeah, excellent. If you were to say this current book, Understanding Jeremiah, if you were to say this book is for blank, who would you say this book is for? Who would you hope could glean something from this book?
Well, I wrote it at the level to be used primarily by seminary students and like Bible college students who have a serious interest in the Bible. So it's not written at a high scholarly level that is, it's not an extremely dense book. I tried to make it as readable as possible. Tried to put in a lot of the text of Jeremiah so that the reader who's maybe not profoundly familiar with Jeremiah could just read straight through the book without having to constantly go back and, find the correct text in Jeremiah to see what I'm talking about. So it's not for those who are, the very small group of elite scholars who are totally devoted to studying Jeremiah. It is more for students, but it is more for students rather than, it's not a layperson's book. Now, if you're an educated layman, if you're serious about the Bible, I think it could do that person a lot of good. But it's going to be for someone who really wants to try to understand what was the world like that Jeremiah was living in, what structure is there to Jeremiah, why is it written in the order it's written in, again, the question of the Septuagint, those are the kind of things that a student of just the Bible, a serious student of the Bible, such as at seminary, would want to deal with. And of course, a pastor who wants to continue his education would also be able to, I think, to profit from it.
Yeah, good. Having read through it myself, I would agree with all of that. I think that I think pastors too at the end, that you mentioned, could greatly benefit as they're studying through Jeremiah. So good. In the preface to the book, you say this: writing this book has given me a new appreciation for the repetition and apparent disorder in the book of Jeremiah. I'm curious if you can expound on that a little bit, and then maybe give us an example of some of that apparent disorder, and then how you've gained a new appreciation for it.
I quote in the book a very famous scholar who wrote a commentary on Jeremiah, John Bright, famously said that Jeremiah is a hopeless hodgepodge of the book, that it has no order whatsoever. It's purely chaotic. And I don't think that's right, but I understand how he came to that conclusion, because Jeremiah is not at all chronological. He'll have two passages side by side that are decades apart. Often the first passage will be from 20 years after the second passage. So there is no chronological order in Jeremiah. Again, on superficial reading, it's very difficult to see any order to it at all. And so it is correct that the book appears to be a hodgepodge. What I meant by saying I gained an appreciation for it is this. So Jeremiah has places where he will refer to the same incident in two different passages. The famous incident where he tried to leave Jerusalem and was arrested as a traitor and was put into prison, basically. That episode is recounted in two separate passages, but in a way that they're difficult to work together. They're not at all contiguous, and so you have to really work to bring them together. Now, I understand now why Jeremiah did it that way, because in each passage, that episode has a different lesson that he is working with, that he's trying to get out. In writing the book, my book, I would, at one point I'm describing the life of Jeremiah. So obviously I've got to cite passages from Jeremiah when I'm giving kind of the biography of the man. In another place, I'm describing the structure of Jeremiah. So I've got to cite passages there. Another place, I'm describing the theology of Jeremiah. So again, I've got to cite a lot of passages there. But you don't want to keep citing these same passages over and over again. You just wear your reader out. And so I had to constantly work with, okay, where is the best place to cite this passage in full and deal with it? Where is the place where I just maybe mention it in passing or something like that. And so I was constantly having to wrestle with at what point in my book I place a particular text or episode. And I think you have the same thing within the book of Jeremiah itself, where Jeremiah and Baruch, his scribe, are wrestling with where to put a given text or a given episode.
Gotcha. That's great. Yeah, I like apparent disorder, and I think we'll talk about structure here in a little bit, but I think you do a good job of giving order to the book where it seemed to be apparent disorder. So good. You mentioned the biography portions of Jeremiah, and also in the preface you say, I can honestly say that I have come to appreciate Jeremiah the prophet above any person of the Old Testament. And so I'm curious, what are some of the things that you gleaned when writing this book that helps you see Jeremiah the person in such a bright light?
Well, first of all, we know more about Jeremiah, or there's more biographical material about Jeremiah in his book than there is about any other prophet. Even a book as big as Isaiah, we don't really have that much information about Isaiah the man or the details of his life. Ezekiel, we have a great deal of chronological information, and we know where he was, but in terms of his emotional life, his inner life, a lot of episodes from his life, we don't really have that. And so we have an enormous amount of information about Jeremiah the man in the book. And I found that really fascinating because Jeremiah, as you know, he's often very transparent about how he's feeling. If he's very angry, very upset, he'll say so. And that itself was fascinating to me to try to delve into that issue. There are two other things about Jeremiah that really grabbed me. First of all, he was a prophet in a time of crisis. It was a time of enormous political upheaval. It was a time that Jerusalem was under severe threat, and of course it was destroyed. It was a time of great political conflict, as there were essentially two warring political parties in Jerusalem, basically the pro-Babylonian and the pro-Egyptian parties. And so Jeremiah was caught in this kind of maelstrom of conflict that he had to wrestle through, and that he had to maintain his integrity and preach the word in that situation. And I found that really applicable to our current situation. The other thing about Jeremiah that for me was very appealing, he's so human. Not a single miracle is attributed to Jeremiah. Now he does, of course, he has a few prophecies that come true, the big one being the fall of Jerusalem. He has a few other prophecies in the book that come true. But in terms of a miracle, like Isaiah and Hezekiah when Sennacherib was at the gates of Jerusalem or something like that, or Elijah raising a dead boy back to life, you don't have anything like that in Jeremiah. And yet he maintained his fidelity to God. And so I found that appealing because no disrespect to someone like Elijah or Elisha or something like that, but it's a little harder for me to identify with a man who can raise a boy from the dead. Whereas Jeremiah and his struggles and his sense of isolation, his sense of estrangement and loneliness as he maintained his fidelity to God, I found that very appealing.
Good. So just so that we're all clear, you've never raised a boy from the dead?
I never have.
No. Okay. Good. So, I agree. It's a little difficult to identify with those who do. Great. So that gives us a good. I think what I'm going for in some of those questions is just kind of how you approach the book, things you gleaned from the book as you wrote, right? Because you're taking the content of Jeremiah, studying it deeply, and then distilling it down into stuff that's helpful for us. And so that's all helpful for just kind of knowing how it came about. The first aspect of the subheading in this book is the setting, right? So we're thinking historical setting here. And you spend a couple of chapters putting that historical background together with kind of internationally what's going on with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, but then also what's happening even with the last kings of Judah. And I know from my experience, I find that a lot of times understanding what the prophet is saying and or doing is sometimes dependent on that historical background. So I'm wondering if there's any, can you give us any insights or things that you gleaned about the historical background of Jeremiah? And you kind of hinted at a couple of things there already, but are there any insights from that historical background that you can give us that would illustrate the importance of the historical background?
Well, I think the thing that struck me strongest is the fact that Jeremiah came up, or he was born, in the reign of Josiah. And of course, Josiah was the reforming king. Josiah was the one who really walked after David and had a heart after God and was determined to get rid of all the idolatrous shrines and bring down the high places and cleanse the temple, all this kind of thing. And they found a copy of the law during the reign of Josiah. So for someone like the young Jeremiah, I mean, what a heady, optimistic time that must have been. I mean, I think of myself in my youth and even the students I see around here, you know, when you are young and you have felt a call of God and you see things happening, you can just become very caught up in it and very excited. And you think, wow, this is the great revival we've all been waiting for. In fact, in a sense, I can even identify that because, you know, I'm old enough that I came up in, if you even know this term, in the days of the Jesus movement. So like the 70s, there was a great turning to evangelical Christianity here in America. It was kind of when Billy Graham was at his peak, just before, you know, he was getting older, but he was at his most powerful, so to speak. He was having huge crusades and movements like InterVarsity, Campus Crusade. They were just doing incredibly well. And I was a member of an InterVarsity chapter on my campus. And it just seemed like, you know, wow, everybody's turning to God. And over the course of my life, I've seen things change radically in the U.S. and in the American churches. And so Jeremiah went from being a young man called of God to be a prophet, hearing this scroll of the law read, living in the reign of this super devout reforming King Josiah. And then, stunningly, Josiah is killed in battle. Not what you'd expect. And his successor, Jehoiakim, is an absolute apostate. And it turns out all the people are on Jehoiakim's side. And everything falls apart. And so I think the book of Jeremiah needs to be read against that background. And again, that was for me, that really grabbed me about the life of Jeremiah and about how important knowing his life relates to the meaning of the book.
Yeah, that's helpful. I know that I oftentimes will encourage students, like when you're looking at the prophets, remember that the historical books, you just kind of, they're not two separate sets of books. Like the prophets are prophesying during the events of the historical books. And of course, you mentioned Josiah and that sort of thing. I'm curious, this is not, I don't have this one here, but I'm curious, do you think that the book of the law that was found was the whole Pentateuch?
I think probably it was. I mean, I think normally the law, when they say that, they mean the Pentateuch. They don't mean Deuteronomy. And so that would be my assumption.
Okay, I'm going to jot that down real quick here. Great. Excellent. Yeah, historical background I find is very helpful for understanding a prophet and kind of his life, who he is and where he came from, which is a lot of, I think, what you're trying to do in this book. we mentioned earlier the apparent disorder of the book. So I'm thinking here now of structure of Jeremiah. In chapter 6, the first sentence is, given a casual reading, Jeremiah is almost devoid of any identifiable structure. And you kind of said as much earlier. But by the end of that chapter, I think, in my opinion, you provide a clearly articulated chiastic structure for the book, which is anything but devoid of structure. And so I'm thinking here, the question I'm thinking of is more related to methodology, not necessarily defending the chiasm. They can read the book for that. But how did you arrive at that structure? And what could you give the audience here related to maybe steps to take to identify a structure in a book that seems to not have one?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I would say is sometimes I get the impression in reading some scholars that they are absolutely determined to find a chiasm or a parallel structure, that they're going to find it. They're going to find some way to turn this text into a chiastic text or something like that. I don't do that. In fact, many proposed chiastic or parallel structures I see, I just look at it and I look at their information and that's just not convincing to me. So I do not think you should make finding some structure like that your goal. I think what you should do is just read the text as carefully as you can, and just as you read it, think through, okay, what is going on with this text and what jumps out at you? So what jumped out at me in Jeremiah was this. As a general rule, in the prophets, you will constantly see one basic pattern. That pattern is they open up with accusations and judgment. They proceed on to talk about how, Israel will be destroyed. Then, towards the end, they give passages that speak of redemption, and God regathering the nation, and ultimately they will talk about some kind of eschatological salvation. So in many books, this is very, very clear. They may have a little bit about redemption early on, but for the most part, they will consistently talk about sin and judgment until the very end, then they give salvation. So like Amos is a classic example of this. For the most part, Hosea operates this way. He has a little on salvation earlier on, chapter 3. But Ezekiel ends with passages like the Valley of Dry Bones, and then the vision of the temple and the river of life and so forth. So it's very, very common structure. And so what struck me is right in the middle of Jeremiah, he has his salvation passage, chapter 30 to 33. It's just he's going, you're sinful, God is going to destroy you, God is going to judge you, Jerusalem is doomed. And then suddenly there's this salvation passage, 4 chapters, and then he's back to condemning them and telling them God is going to judge them and giving examples of their sin and rebellion and so forth. So I thought, what is going on there? And so I didn't immediately say, well, this must be chiastic because it's got salvation in the middle of it. But I did continue on to try to find, all right, looking at the opening chapters, the main thing you see in the opening chapters up through about chapter 20 is they're all just a series of undated, and often you can't even tell where one ends and the other begins, messages. So there'll just be all these little oracles, all these little messages that, again, appear to have little structure. And I looked at that and I thought, well, there does seem to be 2 things he is constantly talking about. He will talk about how Judah and Jerusalem are engaged in deception. Often it is self-deception. They believe destruction will never befall them, or they are deceiving each other, they're lying to each other, or the prophets are lying, something like that. So you have a whole bunch of passages that in one way or another talk about deception, and interspersed with those, in between each one, you have a passage that talks about how Jerusalem will be destroyed. Jerusalem will face God's judgment and be destroyed. And so that, that back and forth between judgment and deception, that struck me. And then it struck me, well, the beginning is all of these undated oracles against Jerusalem and Judah. And then the end of the book is all these undated oracles against the nations. So I thought, well, that's interesting. And then it struck me that you yet also have, before the salvation passages, you have a bunch of passages that are dated, that, deal with various episodes and judgments. And then after the salvation passages, you have a whole series of passages that are dated and, again, generally deal with episodes, talk about the evil of the monarchy and so forth. And so the idea of a structure began to emerge. And then as I began to pursue it, I began to see where within that structure there would be some clear parallels. Like, I don't remember the exact chapters right now, but in one side of the chiasm, it'll talk about wine. And in the parallel passage of the chiasm, it'll also talk about wine. And so I began to see all these different parallels. And so out of all that, I developed what I believe is a chiastic structure for the book of Jeremiah.
Yeah, that's good. That's really helpful. And I think what I would do is encourage you guys to pick up the book, of course, and read that section. And I think when I was reading through it, it's just kind of it's a good example of how to let the text be what drives that conclusion of a chiastic structure, rather than going into it and saying, I'm looking for one. Right. It's almost like, as I read through that, and of course, having you in class and knowing you as a colleague, I kind of thought, he didn't go into this looking for it. This was a deep study of the text, and then it kind of came to the surface as you studied. And so I just wanted them to hear that too. So that's very, very helpful. Okay, so now let's get a little bit technical, okay? As if we haven't been technical already, right? Let's get a little bit technical. One of the major, I think we could say, problems with Jeremiah would be related to the composition. You mentioned already the Septuagint being shorter, the Masoretic text being quite different in a variety of places. The order of the content is different. There's apparent these duplicates in the Masoretic text. So some of these sorts of things. And I think that this evidence kind of poses initially the question of, okay, which version of Jeremiah would be the, quote, original, and therefore be the one that should be in our Bibles? This is kind of what the text critical world might be looking for. And I have to grant I'm a little biased, but I think you did a good job of handling this in the book as well. And it begins for you with this question of, what does the text of Jeremiah tell us about that most original form? And you take it back to Jeremiah 36 and that scroll that Baruch copied. So tell us a little bit more about this chapter, how you began to iron out that composition issue. And I would even say here, feel free to give any details from that chapter that you feel like are helpful.
Okay, let me back up a little bit further even than that to talk about the situation with Jeremiah and what I was thinking, what I was doing when I wrote that section. So the Septuagint is shorter than the Masoretic text of Jeremiah, and it is in one very significant way in a different order from the Masoretic text, namely the oracles against the nations come after 25:13 in the Masoretic text. Well, 25:13 in the Septuagint too, but from that point on the numbering is different. So anyway, in the Septuagint of Jeremiah, you get up to 25:13, then you have all the oracles against the nations, and then you proceed on from there. Whereas in the Masoretic text, of course, as you know, the oracles against the nations are at the end. So just briefly, what I'm saying is the two are really different in that regard. And again, the Masoretic text is longer, just in terms of individual verses having more words in them frequently than the Septuagint. Now, there's one simple way to deal with this, which is how it has been dealt with maybe 100, 200 years ago. And that's just to say, well, the Septuagint translator, he just abbreviated the Masoretic text. He just cut a lot of material out. And for some unknown reason, he moved the oracles against the nations. And that way you could say, then clearly the Masoretic or the Proto-Masoretic text is first, and the Septuagint is a modification of the Masoretic text. I don't know of anyone who believes that now among scholars, and the reasons are very clear. I mentioned 25:13. So 25:13, God says, and I will fulfill all the words that I have spoken, that Jeremiah has written in this book against all nations. But then in the Masoretic text, there's nothing against the nations. Whereas in the Septuagint, it immediately goes into the oracles against the nations. So in the Septuagint, it makes perfect sense. In the Masoretic text, you're left scratching your head. Well, why does he say against all nations and say nothing about the nations? So that's very confusing. And I'll just make one or two other points on this line very quickly. In the Septuagint, the oracles against the nations don't seem to have been carefully thought through. That is to say, there's no order to the arrangement of the oracles against the nations. The sequence of them seems to have no clear order. Whereas in the Masoretic text, they do have a clear order. That again kind of implies the Septuagint is earlier. That, in other words, they looked at the oracles against the nations and said, well, this is kind of a mess. It needs to be given some kind of order. And so for those two reasons there, it's pretty clear the Septuagint is the earlier version. As for the length of the text, well, we could go into that. If you have questions, I'll talk about it. But without going into further detail, it is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of just about every scholar I think you'll find on Jeremiah, it's pretty clear the Septuagint is the earlier text. Now, there are some people who say, well, okay, that means the Septuagint is the authoritative text, and that's the one we should read. Well, in my opinion, that is not correct. The Septuagint is, to put it really simply, a first draft. If you are a writer, you often put together a first draft. And it often, when you look at it, you think, well, that's not really how I want it to be. Now, in my view, where was the first draft composed? Well, we know from the book of Jeremiah that Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch were in Egypt at the end of Jeremiah's life. They were taken by force to Egypt. Where does the Septuagint originate from? It originates from Egypt. So that would indicate the reason the Septuagint follows this earlier version is that that was, so to speak, the Egyptian version. Now, we know from Jeremiah 45 that Baruch, his scribe, was destined kind of for a life of wandering. The book of Baruch, which is apocryphal, but it maintains a tradition in the beginning of the book that Baruch went to Babylon. And I think, in other words, I take that evidence and say, okay, let's assume Baruch went to Babylon. Now, Baruch, we know from other passages in Jeremiah, I think if I remember correctly, 31 or 32, Baruch handled all of Jeremiah's papers. He handled everything. He was, so to speak, an intimate companion of Jeremiah. He was not just, like a dictation machine. He was, in many ways, almost a partner with Jeremiah. In fact, the Jews seem to have thought that Baruch was the senior partner. they accused in chapter 42, 43, they accused Jeremiah of simply doing what Baruch told him to do. So Baruch was intimately involved in the book of Jeremiah, and he was, I think you could say, he was the closest friend of Jeremiah's life. He went into exile with Jeremiah, not only to Egypt, but when they were hiding from Jehoiakim. So again, Baruch at least goes to Babylon, as I believe. He has all of Jeremiah's papers. He knows all of Jeremiah's thinking. And in my opinion, that's where the Masoretic text was compiled. It was not compiled by some anonymous redactor. It was compiled by a man who intimately worked with Jeremiah through his entire ministry. And I think he gave us the version of Jeremiah that he knew faithfully reflected the actual message of Jeremiah, was a better presentation of the message of Jeremiah than that first draft that is reflected in the Septuagint. So that's a long-winded answer. Oh, the thing about chapter 36. I'll just say this. When you read Jeremiah, it is evident that for a long time, Jeremiah and Baruch were simply keeping all kinds of little records. They would keep records of letters he wrote. They would keep records of his messages. They would keep records of episodes in his life. So it was like, in our terms, they were just carrying around a file cabinet of all kinds of stuff from the life of Jeremiah. And at some point, they needed to start to put this together coherently into a book. And the first place where we see it coherently put into a book is in chapter 36, where they put together a scroll of Jeremiah. Jeremiah at this point is under constraint. He cannot go to the temple district. He is forbidden to go there, but Baruch can. So Baruch, he has this very early kind of proto-book of Jeremiah that he carries into the temple district, and he reads it. And everybody gets all upset, and they take it to the king. And of course, that's the episode where the king has the scroll read, and he burns it. He cuts it to pieces with a scribe's pen or scribe's pen knife and throws it into the fire. And a couple of the nobles say to Baruch, you and Jeremiah need to get out of here. He is going to kill you. And he had already killed the prophet Uriah. And so Baruch heads back to Jeremiah. They go into hiding, but they also reproduce the original contents of the scroll. And then the text tells us as time went on, they added to it. So I think that chapter gives us the genesis of the book of Jeremiah, and so I built my theory around that.
Excellent. Yeah, that's that's really helpful, and I think that you and I've talked about this book before, and kind of how that was a big highlight, I think, of this Understanding Jeremiah book. That something that I think a lot of scholars, you'll read commentaries on Jeremiah, and they'll kind of start the whole thing off with a statement of, we're going to assume the final form of Jeremiah as they're interpreting it, but you've dealt with something I think is very important, and I think done it very well also. This is the last question I have for you before we do some Q&A and a little bit of background. When I was in seminary, I remember reading through Jeremiah just in my private devotions and then thinking to myself, wow, this sounds a lot like our world today, similar things that you mentioned before. And the last chapter of the book is Jeremiah in the Christian pulpit. That's how you've titled it. But you're not thinking about how to preach Jeremiah. That's in the commentary that you did with Calvin Pearson. So how you frame the chapter is like this. You say, I want to point out below how Jeremiah is a model for the minister living through a time of great upheaval, polarization, and even calamity. The controversies he faced have parallels in our time. Like him, we are in a world gone mad. And I just wonder if you could maybe share with us a couple of maybe one or two of the little nuggets of wisdom that you learned from Jeremiah about how a minister might handle this world gone mad.
Yeah, I'll tell you what was most striking to me in Jeremiah as I wrestled with it with regard to the Christian pulpit, the Christian ministry today. So there are some things that are very obvious that we can easily identify with. Like in ancient Jerusalem, they had the cult of Baal and child sacrifice and all kinds of sexual immorality and all that kind of thing. Well, we can certainly identify with that, all the immorality, the abortion that we have, all the kind of things where we are critiquing gross immorality, abortion, things like that, is easy to identify with. So that was straightforward. A couple of things that the more I thought about them, the more they struck me. First, Jeremiah was regarded as a heretic. We think they all knew they were pagans, they were heretics, and they didn't care. But the fact is, they thought they were orthodox. They thought Jeremiah was the heretic. So Jeremiah will criticize them. He'll say, do not deceive yourself, saying the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. They believed the fact that they had Yahweh's temple meant Jerusalem could not be destroyed. God was going to protect Jerusalem no matter what. And when Jeremiah said that's not true, he said, look, the shrine at Shiloh was destroyed. This temple can be destroyed too. They decided he was a heretic. He did not have sufficient faith in God in their mind. Not only that, they even considered, their paganism to be orthodox. Chapter 44, he's dealing with the Jewish exiles in Egypt, and he's confronting them over the worship of the Queen of Heaven. And they said, all our trouble started when Josiah made us stop worshiping the Queen of Heaven. That's when everything fell apart. And so they considered him to be the heretic. And those who combined the worship of Yahweh with the worship of the Queen of Heaven to be the Orthodox. And so what I'm saying is, where this really struck me is, it's not just the atheist and the radical left and all that thing that we need to be aware of. We can be hit from the other side. You can uphold biblical standards and be attacked within the church for doing that by people who firmly believe they are orthodox and you're the heretic. The other thing is, I mentioned this already, Jeremiah was accused of being a traitor. So the most famous episode is when he tried to leave Jerusalem because he was to go out and to redeem some property, but he was stopped as he was going out the gate, and they said, hey, you're Jeremiah, you're that traitor, and he was arrested, and he was accused of being, a turncoat for the Babylonians and for Nebuchadnezzar. And, again, we are prone to think of ourselves, I myself, I'm very conservative, not only theologically, but politically. And we're inclined to think of ourselves as, we're the people on the right, both literally and metaphorically. We think, we're the ones who love God and love the country and all that sort of thing. But we have to be careful. You can get into a mindset whereby, I don't know how else to put this, even your patriotism can become heretical. And that was the case of the people in Jerusalem. They were certain God was on their side. All they had to do was keep up the good fight, maintain a united front against against Nebuchadnezzar. And here was Jeremiah discouraging the people with all of his downer prophecy and making them think that they couldn't win the battle. And so for them, he was not only a heretic, he was a traitor. And so the path of godliness is a difficult one. I don't take these in political terms, but the exhortation not to turn aside to the right or the left. It's easy to just veer off in one direction, and you think, well, it doesn't matter how far I go in this direction because this is the correct direction, when in fact you can actually fall into serious error. So that to me practically was a profound lesson from Jeremiah.
Yeah, that's really good. I just think kind of the balance of biblical fidelity and faithful preaching, and then let the Lord take care of the rest of it. So good. Well, thank you for those answers and that insight into kind of how you approach the book and some of the things in the book.